From the time man first walked on this earth, gods and monsters were placeholders for the natural phenomena that cannot be explained. As the ages wore on and the mysteries of the universe began to be unraveled, the need for monsters to explain what a thunderstorm or typhoon was went away. However, mankind's fascination with creatures larger than our understanding persisted. This is the time where many of these stories changed the meaning of monsters from something unexplained in the fantastical realm to indirectly explaining the natural realm through metaphor. This continues today with the novels, films, and other media we consume. The creatures and what they represent are in a musical chair type dance, where they are constantly interchanged, always in a state of flux. A revolving door of metaphor, if you will. Perhaps the monster that best exemplifies this ever-shifting concept is the cinematic titan that has been terrorizing, then saving, then back to terrorizing, then maybe being a threat, then being kinda nice but still an asshole, and everything in between. Godzilla. Godzilla. The purpose of this video is to not necessarily talk about the thematic elements of the films featuring Godzilla themselves. Instead, I'm breaking down what Godzilla represents in each film, though given the fact that Godzilla is usually central to what each film is about, there's going to be a lot of cross-analysis here. Today, I'll be discussing the first 5 entries in the Godzilla series, that being the original Godzilla, Godzilla Raids Again, King Kong vs. Godzilla, Mothra vs. Godzilla, and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. We begin at the beginning. Godzilla, 1954. I'm going to assume that everyone knows Godzilla is a metaphor for nuclear weapons. However, I think that many people take that at face value and don't get to appreciate the more layered storyline. On March 1st, 1954, fishing boat Lucky Dragon No. 5 was covered in radioactive ash after the Castle Bravo thermonuclear test. American scientists had incorrectly predicted the impact of the blast, resulting in the death of one of the crew members from complications due to radiation poisoning. The tuna, which had already been shipped to markets, was also contaminated, and a massive recall had to be made in order to protect the public from mass radiation poisoning. Just over 8 months later, on November 3rd, 1954, the original Godzilla film was released and opens with a fishing boat sinking after a blinding light engulfs the crew. I find it pretty clear that the film is less about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but instead the ongoing nuclear tests that the US was conducting during the 50s. Godzilla in this film represents the end product of nuclear testing, an all-powerful creature that survives at the heart of atomic fire. Impossible to kill unless an even greater and crueler power is used. To drive home this point, the rampage that Godzilla enacts uses imagery of what occurred in 1945 during the original atomic bomb detonations. But instead of saying that Godzilla is directly like these bombings, the film instead implies that continued nuclear tests will inevitably cause a similar result. The film still has the early beginnings of Godzilla's transformation into a more mythical, force of nature kind of character. In the scenes on Odo Island early in the film, Godzilla does not show its rage as a nuclear fire, but instead a typhoon-like storm, a force beyond what mankind can contain. Godzilla does not actually reveal itself until the scientists from the far more modernized and coincidentally westernized mainland arrive to investigate. I'm not trying to imply causality in that when the westernized citizens arrive on the traditional island, Godzilla truly enters the film, but I do think that is an interesting angle to view the sequence through. Needless to say, the original Godzilla was a groundbreaking film for its time, not just as a visual effects spectacle, but as a thoroughly profound film that chose to take its concept seriously and presented its themes of thermonuclear testing and its terrifying prediction of what those tests would produce with thought-provoking precision. I do think the original Godzilla film is something that more or less exists in its own time capsule, unable to be replicated or copied despite the best efforts of Toho and their competitors. I think this is perfectly exemplified with the sequel, Godzilla Raids Again. Godzilla is absolutely still a metaphor for nuclear testing, complete with vague references to the monster causing trouble for local fishermen, but the big issue with this film is that it treats Godzilla as something that Japan has dealt with before. There isn't a lot of urgency in dealing with Godzilla. Much of the movie is spent focusing on daily activities that don't really add much to the overall plot. Many fans consider this to be a completely skippable entry, a cash grab thrown together to capitalize on the surprising success of the original. But I find it interesting to view this film as a companion piece to the original due to how it deals with tragedy. The first movie obviously looks at the events as horrific and depressing, but Raids Again looks at it from a different angle, an angle of opportunity and hope. Despite the carnage that Godzilla and Anguirus cause, the characters still remain shockingly positive. One even mentioning how they will rebuild and everyone sharing a laugh at the expense of another character. The battle between the monsters continues on this path to be more representative of forces of nature, rather than some kind of man-made horror. Destruction for the sake of spectacle as opposed to being a commentary on tragedy. Despite my personal warmth to this film, it is a tragic case of lightning failing to strike twice. From a metaphorical perspective at least, Godzilla loses much of the power and weight behind its message despite the best intentions of the filmmakers. King Kong vs. Godzilla is a somewhat difficult film to talk about. On one hand, it's a brilliant decision to frame the famous fight as a boxing match, with the characters looking on as an enthralled audience waiting to see which monster will come out on top. On the other hand, it's difficult to look at what Godzilla stands for in this film, since many of the things Godzilla does are just accepted as fact. Godzilla fights the military and destroys cities because it's just what Godzilla does. The fight between Godzilla and Kong has little subtext behind it. It could have been an interesting struggle between the monster that represents the traditional and natural world, Kong, and the unnatural and unrelenting Godzilla. A true battle between Eastern and Western ideals. Kong, despite coming from America, could represent qualities opposite to the capitalist machine that orchestrated his kidnapping for advertising purposes. Godzilla contrasting the ape with the end product of the American military-industrial complex from Japan's view. Instead, the movie tries to parody television marketing. The setup for deeper meaning is there, but I don't think King Kong vs. Godzilla capitalizes on the natural struggle that is present when you match two creatures like this together. Thankfully, Mothra vs. Godzilla does this spectacularly. Good water. I find it daunting to describe the amount of thematic material present in Mothra vs. Godzilla. I think this might be the film that beats the original for its raw thematic elements. It's a struggle between Mothra and Godzilla, life and death, the worst of humanity and the best of it, greed and warmongering, peace and humanity. The film capitalizes on all these elements by A, actually addressing them unlike the previous film, and B, integrating the human storyline directly into how that dynamic plays out. We continue the trend of Godzilla edging ever closer to being a force of nature, with this film opening with a foreboding typhoon, one that brings not only destruction but also washes Godzilla back onto the Japanese mainland. When Godzilla actually awakens in the movie, he rises from the ground, an ancient, titan-like earthquake ready to destroy the land. Godzilla, as a nuclear metaphor though, strangely has a far smaller presence despite the inclusion of Infant Island being desolate from atomic testing. The film does mention that Godzilla is effectively an equivalent though. It's interesting that while the movie never makes a particular point of saying it, it seems that Godzilla's goal is targeting Mothra's egg with the same purposeful grimace as the human villains from the capitalist Happy Enterprises. I think that the filmmakers had a certain amount of disdain for the capitalist economic system, and I can't help but wonder why. Still, the film seems to equate late-stage capitalism with the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. In short, making the capitalist villains as bad as Godzilla in their own way. Godzilla is presented in an interesting context when paired with Mothra. Mothra, of course, representing life, fertility, rebirth, etc. So, by offering Godzilla as the antagonist, Godzilla naturally represents the opposite of those values. That, in turn, reflects upon the characters, the human villains being reflective of what Godzilla is and representing the worst of humanity. And that also extends to the protagonists, mirroring what Mothra represents, being the best of humanity. This duality of the human character not only being represented in the actions and characters of the larger-than-life kaiju, as well as being essential to the human plot of the film, really makes Mothra vs. Godzilla a standout movie for the franchise. I highly recommend giving it a second chance. Believe me, for years, I was a little lukewarm on this film, but rewatching, and especially now that I am experiencing late-stage capitalism, it's worth it. Mothra vs. Godzilla is exactly the type of sequel the franchise needed in this moment. Deep, thought-provoking, and expanding on the premise of the original, but not being bound by it. The perfect jumping-off point for Godzilla to become whatever it wanted. I have no shame. Ghidorah the three-headed monster marks a turning point for the franchise, the official transition from villain to hero for Godzilla. Now, this does complicate my job for the most part because when Godzilla is the heroic monster, it muddies the water for what Godzilla represents. Toho deliberately goes out of their way to keep mentions of Godzilla's nuclear origins to a minimum, since it makes it a bit problematic to root for what is effectively a stand-in for atomic bombs. This is the first Godzilla film where I think Ishiro Honda, the primary director of these early films, truly brings a globalist ideal to the franchise. There are some pretty heavy-handed themes that all life on Earth is connected and that only together as a global ecosystem can Earth survive. This effectively removes the most interesting aspect of the series from this film. The reflective look at man's own hubris has brought a nice subtle complexity to the monster, as well as serving as a reminder that humans have their flaws. However, since that threat is not man-made, it becomes a sort of us versus them type of story, them being the eponymous Ghidorah the three-headed monster, which, while its design is clearly pulled from Japanese folklore, doesn't really stand for anything outside of big monster that needs to be fought. Of course, the biggest thing to talk about in this film is Godzilla's change of face into a good guy. At the beginning, Godzilla is still a villain, but it feels almost as if it's the same old, same old. Godzilla is causing destruction because that's just his personality. On top of this, more human-like qualities are added to the creatures in this film, reducing their godlike presence. We are no longer in a world we know being beseeched by the fantastic. It's now just pure fantasy. The one line that particularly stands out for me is when the Shojibun are translating the discussion between Godzilla, Mothra, and Rodan. They say both Godzilla and Rodan refuse to help humanity because humanity bullies them. Yes, bullies them. Now, this can be interpreted as the filmmakers using the Monster Conference as a call for humanity to put aside our differences and work together over our childish differences, as represented by talking kaiju. However, I feel that the specific usage of the word bully is significant. It effectively renders all of Godzilla's divine atomic-fueled rage against humanity's vanity towards nature as a schoolyard scuffle. Godzilla is not some godlike avenger set to put humanity straight. He's a petulant child who got pushed off the swing set. I feel that the choice of words really diminishes and retroactively devalues the importance of previous films, but that's okay. From the instant Godzilla started the path towards being a pop culture icon, this moment was always going to come, and it's fitting that it happens here with the introduction of the greatest villain of the series. Whether it was intended or not, Ghidorah the three-headed monster was the major step in turning Godzilla from thought-provoking art house into mainstream popcorn entertainment. If this was a good decision or not is more up to opinion than anything objective. What I'd rather like to know is what led to this moment. What factors led to Godzilla changing from the embodiment of Japan's collective trauma over nuclear war to being a defender of Earth? Could it be the de-escalating tension between Japan and the United States? Was it the fact that 20 years had passed since World War II and the audience had simply moved on? Or had the Japanese made peace with nuclear science, with the first nuclear energy plant opening a mere 2 years later in Tokai? Or perhaps the studio was eager to wring out as much cash from their productive cow until it was sucked of all of its worth and shamelessly stripped the character of most of its meaning for money. One thing is for certain, this trend will continue in the upcoming films in this analysis. That's it for this video. Please stay tuned for future videos from Saturn Hex channel. I hope to continue the series and explore all the other films in the franchise. I want to end this video by saying that the analysis that I have provided here are just my own opinions. Some of them are informed, some of them are constructed from various facts and information I have, and some are just purely my own guesses. You are almost guaranteed to have a different conclusion on some of these films, and I want to encourage those of you with different opinions to comment on this video. But I do want to stress, please keep it civil. Words online can translate to real-world consequences for real people. Thank you. Jasper, you're such a good boy. You're such a good boy.